Hi, this is Jason Baker, and welcome back to our lecture on pipelines. Well, let's jump into Jenkins, and we'll start working with Jenkins to build out some basic pipeline stages. So, Jenkins is an open source continuous integration, continuous delivery server that is written in the Java programming language. It was a project that was started back at Sun Microsystems back in 2004. And at the time, it was known as the Hudson Project. And after Oracle bought Sun, the Hudson project was forked and it was renamed Jenkins. Now, if you were to look under the hood at some of the Jenkins code libraries, you'd see that some of them still have the Hudson name. So there's still that sort of lineage in place under the hood when you're working with Jenkins. Jenkins is an open source server, so you can download it and run it for free. And there's also a commercial version of Jenkins available with commercial support from a company called CloudBees. Now, when we're working with Jenkins, there are a few key terms that I want you to know. First of all, within Jenkins, you create jobs, and a job within Jenkins defines a specific set of tasks or like a workflow that Jenkins will execute. Every time you execute a job, you create what's called a build. So every job will have multiple builds. Every time you execute that job, it's creating a build. When when you execute a job, Jenkins will create a workspace for the job. And a workspace is just simply a special directory location that's located on a Jenkins managed system. And you can think of the workspace as being sort of like this temporary space that Jenkins uses to execute the job. Because oftentimes when you're running a job, you might be doing things like cloning a repository, and then you're going to be maybe compiling some software. And all of that requires disk space somewhere, some temporary storage. So every build is going to use a workspace, and that's the temporary storage space that Jenkins is using while it's executing a job. Jenkins uses an executor to execute a job, and an executor is, think of an executor as like a process, and you can have multiple executors defined on your system, meaning that Jenkins can run multiple jobs concurrently. And that's very common. If you've got a large software development team, you might have you might have 5 to 10 jobs running at any given point in time as people are committing changes to different repositories, and they're triggering different pipeline builds. When Jenkins runs a job, you can set environment variables for that particular job. And environment variables, we've encountered these a few times in the course. These are key pair values that are made available within the shell environment where the job is running. And so the job can actually read data from environment variables and use those as input parameters into the job. And then finally, Jenkins itself is sort of like this software framework, and most of the heavy lifting in Jenkins is done by plugins, and these are software modules which are used to expand Jenkins functionality. And this is one of the reasons why Jenkins is so prolific in the marketplace, because there are just hundreds and hundreds of different plugins available. Pretty much anything you need Jenkins to do, there's already a plugin written to do it. So Jenkins is kind of like the Swiss Army knife of CI/CD systems. It's not the most beautiful system. In some ways, from an interface perspective, it feels a little clunky. It feels like a legacy web application. But don't be fooled by the sort of basic UI of Jenkins. Under the hood, it's a very complex, very powerful software platform. Okay, well let's jump into Jenkins and review a couple different parts of the Jenkins interface. And in order to do this, I need to sort of juggle two screens. I need to juggle this presentation uh, page, and we'll look at a web browser. Now, in the beginning of this lecture, I had recommended that you launch a Jenkins stack. And I've already done that. I've launched a Jenkins stack and I've logged into the Jenkins server already. So um, now that I'm in the server, I want to take a look at a few parts of the Jenkins platform. Um, On the left-hand side, you see a navigation menu, and this navigation menu allows you to access the different features within Jenkins. Like you can manage the Jenkins configuration, you can create new jobs within Jenkins, you can look at some build history information, and so on. At the top part of Jenkins, in the top navigation menu, you can see this little area where this is a what we call a breadcrumb menu. And if I click on Manage Jenkins and click on an item within Manage Jenkins, here I'm clicking on Configuration System. You see that this breadcrumb menu begins to expand. So I can use this to sort of figure out from a navigation perspective where I am within the Jenkins platform. If I want to get back to that main home page, I can just click on this Jenkins link and the breadcrumb menu, and it takes me all the way back. Um, I can look at the build history within Jenkins, and I don't have any builds yet, but I could look at everything that's going on within my system. I can look at the queue of current jobs. There are currently no jobs in the queue, and there are currently no running jobs. You can see this executor status here. And this shows us that on our Jenkins master server, this is what we're currently logged into, we have two executors that we can use. And we also have Jenkins connected to a slave node, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And that also has two executors available. Executors, think of them as being like, they're like available slots where you can run a build. And um, Jenkins will give you a status update on currently running builds and which executor they're running on and which server they're running on. I mentioned that most of the functionality in Jenkins is based around plugins. If I click on the Manage Jenkins menu, then I can manage a lot of different software configuration components of Jenkins. If I scroll down here, then you see there's one called Manage Plugins. I'll click on that, and if I click on this Installed tab, you see that I have lots and lots of different plugins installed on the system. You can easily install new plugins by going to the Available tab and either scrolling down the list, or you can kind of filter the list. There's just literally hundreds and hundreds of different plugins that are available. Sometimes when you install a plugin, you have to restart Jenkins, and it'll kind of walk you through that process. It's very easy to do, and other times you don't need to to restart the Jenkins server. And one thing that really confuses people is that when you install plugins on a Jenkins server, you're actually expanding the functionality of the server. And these Jenkins, the Jenkins UI will also change as you add new plugins on the system. So if you were to look at two Jenkins servers sort of side by side, two servers that were created by two different organizations, there could be some significant differences from a user interface standpoint between the two systems just based on the different plugins that are installed on the Jenkins instances. Okay, well, one of the principal things that you'll do in Jenkins is you will create new jobs and you create new, sometimes they call them projects. In order to do that, you go to the main page of Jenkins and you click on New Item. And in New Item, we're going to give it a name and we're just going to call it a project that's called Show Environment. And we're going to create what's called a freestyle project. A freestyle project is, well, it kind of lives up to its name. It's a project that can do most anything. It's a project that you're sort of like creating from scratch, and you're going to define sort of every part of the project. So we've specified that we want to create a freestyle project, and we click OK. Jenkins will create the project, and it's going to take us to a a job configuration page. So we can now configure all the different settings for this new show environment job that we created. Let's give the job a description, and the description is we want it to show all environment variables. Show all environment variables, and we're going to scroll down to the bottom, and we're going to so for now you can ignore all these other settings. Sometimes these Jenkins configuration pages can be kind of dense and have lots and lots of settings available. Typically, when you're building and creating a job, there's only like a handful of settings that you're really concerned with. And so I mentioned earlier that Jenkins is kind of like a Swiss Army knife. It can do just about anything. So there are tons and tons of options available for jobs, that you set up. But again, you don't really need to be concerned about all the particular settings. If you do wonder what a setting does, then you can generally there's some help information. So like on on throttle builds, I can click on this question mark and it will give me some insights as to what that particular setting does. Okay, so we've created the job. Now we're going to scroll down and we're going to create a build step. And a build step is just a task, basically, that we want the job to perform. The job could have one build step. The job could have a dozen build steps. We can add more build steps as necessary. So we're going to add a build step, and there are different types of build steps we can create. This one, we're just going to create an execute shell build step. And in the execute shell build step, we specify the shell command that we want the job to run. In this case, I want it to run the env command, which will display all of the environment variables that are present when the job runs. I'm going to pipe that into the sort command so that it will sort those environment variables in alphabetical order. So I'm happy with this job configuration. Now I'm going to save the job, and this takes me back to the job page. And in the job page, I can do things like I can click on configure. That's where I was just at. I was configuring the settings for the job. And I can look at the job history, the build history. There have been no builds for this job. So let's go ahead and build this job. When we say that we're going to build the job, basically that means we're executing the job. We're going to let Jenkins run this job on an executor. So we're going to go ahead and click on build now. It tells us that the build was scheduled and the build already ran. So this was a very fast job. It didn't have to do much. And we've created now a build. If I click on the build number 1, then I can drill down into some more information about this particular build. Now, I know that this build ran successfully. How do I know that? Well, I know that just by looking at the color of this orb next to the build number. If this is blue, that means that the job ran successfully. If it failed, then this orb would be a red color. So I can quickly, just based on the color, I can identify whether the build was successful or not. What I want to do here is I want to look at the output of the build job, and I do that by clicking on the console output. I click on console output, and this console output provides me with all of the output from this particular build. So this is what actually happened when Jenkins ran this build. So you can see in this output that Jenkins ran the environment and sort commands, and it produced all of these environment variables. These are the environment variables that were present in the workspace in the build shell when the job ran. You can see that they're sorted in alphabetical order. I can go back to the project that I created. Now, if I go back up to that main page, which is called the dashboard, you'll see now that on the main screen, it shows me that I have a project defined, which is my show environment project, and that the last time it successfully ran was 2 minutes ago. And you see that it gives me the status of the last build, which was blue and successful. It also gives me something called a weather report. And the weather report right now is sunny, meaning that all of the recent builds of this job have been successful. You'll see what happens if this job fails, and this weather report will change. So let's go back, and we're going to go back into this job. I can just click on the job name, and we're going to reconfigure this project, and we're going to add another step to the project. So we're going to add another build step. And this build step is going to, again, execute a shell command. And the command we want it to run is a command called false. Now, when we run the false command, what it's going to basically do is it's going to return an error code. So we're essentially forcing this job, this project to fail. Let's go ahead and build it again. And we build it again, and you can see that now it's red. So this job failed. If I click on it and click on console output, we'll see that it ran the command false, and when it finished, the status of the build was a failure. I'll go up to the project and I'll go back up to that dashboard. You'll see now that the last run of this job shows that it failed, and now the weather report for this job is cloudy, because it shows us that this build might not be quite stable because one out of the last 2 builds has failed. And this is something, as like a software developer, you're paying close attention to. You want to know if your builds are failing. You want to see, and you want to see how stable your project is or your pipeline is, and so you can look at these quick indicators to understand kind of what's going on with your project. Now let's go back. We're going to go back to the show environment project and reconfigure it again. We're going to we're going to remove that false command. We're going to remove that from the from the project, and we're going to add a new command, and the new command is going to output the current build number. So we're going to add another build step. We're going to execute a shell command, and I'm just going to copy and paste this text in from the presentation. The command is going to echo out the words working with build and then the build number. And you see the build number is encapsulated by these curly braces, and it begins with a $sign. So this syntax represents an interpolated variable value. When Jenkins runs this and executes this step, it will interpolate the value of this variable. And this build underscore number variable is a built-in variable. That's Jenkins provides you with a couple dozen built-in variables that you can use within your jobs. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now let's build the job again. And it ran successfully. I'm going to click on the build number and look at the console output. And when I do that, you can see that it says at the very bottom, working with build number 3. And that matches our build number, right? If I go back up, you can see that last successful build was build number 3. Oftentimes you'll use these variables within your builds, like if you're creating some sort of like build artifact, you might tag that artifact with the actual build number so that you can later on, if you want to, figure out, well, which build on my Jenkins system created a particular artifact, it provides you with that sort of traceability. Okay, so let's do something a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complex, and let's go ahead and actually build a very simple Java project. And in order to do that, we're going to start with an existing GitHub project, and we're going to fork that. We're going to fork it into our own personal account. When you fork a GitHub repository, it's kind of like you're making a complete copy, like a clone of that repository, and it's going to be cloned then into your personal GitHub account, and then you can make copies, or you can make changes then to your forked version of that repository. So I'm going to copy this link here, and I'm going to open up a new tab. I'm going to browse to that repository, and I want to fork it. And I can fork it just by clicking on this fork link within the GitHub page. And it's going to ask me where I want to fork this repository to. I select my personal account, and now GitHub is forking. It's basically creating a completely separate copy of that repository, and it's putting it into my personal account. So now you see that now I have a GitHub, I have a Java project repository now within my personal account, and it tells me, you might not be able to see this because it's very small characters, but it tells me that this repository has been forked from the Java project repository. Okay, now that I have this new repository in my account, I want to create a new freestyle project. And so I'm going to go back to Jenkins and I'm going to create a new project and just call it my Java project. This is a freestyle project and I click OK. So we've created a new freestyle project. Now, in the the project, we need to this freestyle project. We want to connect this freestyle project and connect Jenkins to the GitHub repository. So when we run the project, when we run a build on this project, what we ultimately want Jenkins to do is to go out to GitHub and pull down and clone a copy of that repository into the workspace for the project, because then Jenkins can like do things like run a Java build on the code that's within that repository. So I'm going to define a GitHub project URL for this freestyle project, and my project URL is is the cloned or is the forked repository within my personal account, and I'm also going to specify that this project is going to pull code from source code management, and it's going to be using the Git for source code management. So I specify it's using Git, and I need to provide a repository URL. And I'll provide the repository URL. Now, when I provide that repository URL, it's going to be the same URL that I would use as if I was actually cloning the repository. So it's going to end in the .git extension. There's no need to set any sort of credentials for this repository, because when I forked the repository, it was a public repository, and I forked it into my personal account. It's still a public repository. Like anybody in the world can clone that repository because it is public. And so Jenkins can clone that repository as well without me having to provide Jenkins with any credentials. Okay, at this point, I'm just going to save the project. I'm not going to add any steps yet. So I'm going to save it, and then I want to actually build this project. So I'm going to say build now. And as you can see, it was successful. So I click on the build number. I'm going to click on console output. And if you look at the console output, you can see that it says it's cloning the remote Git repository. So it's building this, it's cloning the master branch of that repository. It's going to build it into this workspace on the Jenkins server, and it's cloning that remote repository. And now the files in that repository are going to be set up in my project workspace on Jenkins. That's all the project is doing right now. It's just cloning that GitHub repository. Let's have Jenkins, because this is a Java project. And so what we want Jenkins to do now is we want it to clone our repository, and we want it to perform a build of that project. And it will perform a build of our project using the Apache Ant software. Ant is a pretty common build manager that you would use to build Java projects. Let's go back into the project and click on the configure link, and we're going to add a build step in the project. And so we add a build step, and this build step is we want it to execute a shell command, and the command we want it to run is the ant command. When we run the ant command, ant is looking for a build XML file that defines how ant should build this particular project. And all of that has already been set up within the repository. So I'm going to save this configuration, and now I want to do another build. And this one was successful, so I click on that build number, click on console output, and you can see that it has fetched the repository, it's cloned the repository, and now it's actually done a build. So it found a build XML file, and it went through a series of build steps. It compiled 3 source files, and it created an output artifact called rectangle2.jar. Now, this Java project is a super simple project. All it's really doing is it's setting up this rectangle class that can perform some calculations. You can use this class to you can use it to calculate the area of a rectangle. And I think it can also calculate the circumference of a rectangle as well. Now, when we run these builds in Jenkins, typically when we have a build project, we don't want to run the build unless we have done some unit testing of our source code first. So let's go ahead and add in a unit testing step on our project. So we go back to the project and reconfigure the project. We scroll down to the build steps, and we're going to add another build step. We're going to execute a shell command. We're going to use ant again, but we're going to pass in a build file, which is called test.xml. And the test.xml build file tells ant how to run some unit tests on our build. And we want the unit tests to run before the actual build itself. So I'm going to move this step before the other step. I can do that just by dragging it before the build step. And I'll go ahead and save and click on build now. And you can see that this takes a little bit longer to run. I click on the third build and look at the console output. And now you can see that it's running some tests. It tells me in the output that 4 tests were run with no failures, and it was able to successfully build the project. Now, we know that these unit tests ran, but it would be really nice to be able to sort of visually see the status, so see some sort of like report on those unit tests. And let's go ahead and add a report. We'll go back and configure the project, and we're going to add a post-build step. So a post-build action. And the post-build actions are executed after the build steps run. The post-build action we want to select this publish JUnit test result report action. And we need to provide it with a set of test report XMLs that it should use to generate the report. I'm just going to copy that setting from the presentation and copy it in here. And then I'm going to click save. Now I'm going to do another build. And you see that it should build successfully again, which it did. Now I'm going to do yet another build. So I'm going to build it a 5th time. And it ran successfully. Now, if I refresh this page, now you notice that this graph appears on the right-hand side, and this is a test result trend graph. Now, all of my tests have been passing, so everything looks blue here. But if I were, if I had like hundreds of tests running and some were failing, I could see then a trend report of my unit tests over time as each build is running. So that's a very useful, helpful way to understand kind of what's going on with a project over time. Because as a software developer, you're paying a lot of attention to these projects and to these builds, and you want to understand the trends of a project and what's going on over time. Is your build healthy? Are some unit tests failing? What's going on? And these visual indicators are really helpful in that regard. So I've been manually triggering this build. Every time I want to run a build of this project, I've just been going in, clicking on the Build Now button in the menu. But most of the time, we want to be able to trigger a build on a project by using some sort of event, like a commit to a Git repository. Anytime somebody commits a new commit to this repository, we'll want we will want this project to execute. We want to execute a build because we want to be able to run unit tests on that code and create a new build. So let's go ahead and set that up. We set that up by creating what's called a webhook integration within GitHub. And what that does is that anytime we make a commit to the GitHub repository, it will send out a web request to our Jenkins server. And Jenkins then will trigger our project. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go back to my forked repository in GitHub, and I'm going to click on the settings link for my repository. Click on integrations and services, and I'm going to add a service. And the service I'm going to add is a Jenkins service. Now there are two listed. So the one you want is the GitHub plugin service. I'm going to select that service. Jenkins is going to ask for my password here. So I'm going to pause for a second. Type in my password. And so I need to configure this integration, and the way I do that is by specifying a Jenkins hook URL. And that usually looks like something like this: http:// and then your Jenkins server IP address. I'm going to go back to my CloudFormation stack and output and pull out that IP address of my Jenkins server. And then where am I at? Here we go, my Jenkins hook URL. So I'm going to paste in the IP address of my server, :8080/GitHub-webhook. And then with a trailing slash like this. So this is the general format of a webhook. When GitHub receives and sees that some sort of change has been made to the repository, it will automatically send out a special web request to my Jenkins server. So I click on the Add Service button, and so now that service has been added. Now, GitHub will send a webhook to my server, but I have to go and configure my job so that it will be triggered based on that webhook. So I go back into my job and I click on the configure link. And then I go down to the build triggers section of my configuration. And I need to enable the GitHub hook trigger for Git SCM polling. So I need to check that and go ahead and save it. And you can see here that I have, I've got 5 jobs or 5 builds for my project. Let's see if we can trigger a new build. I'm going to go back to my repository and go back to the home page for my Java project, my forked Java project repository. And I want to modify this README file here. I'm going to go ahead and click on that README file. And I can edit that file directly in GitHub using a handy web-based file editor. So I'm going to click on the file editor and I'm just going to add some text. And I made a change. And I'm going to commit that change directly to the master branch in the repository. So I commit that change to the repository. And then if I go back to Jenkins, you can see now that there's a pending build. And my build automatically starts like magic. So GitHub just automatically triggered the building of my job or my project within Jenkins because I made a change. And this is a very common pattern that you'll follow when you're setting up your projects within Jenkins. So almost every project is going to be triggered by some sort of Git repository change. Now, one last thing I'll note in this section of the lecture is that when we've been running these builds have been running directly on our Jenkins master server. That's the server that I'm logged into, or that's providing the web interface. Now, you can run jobs on Jenkins, but it's not on the Jenkins master server, but it's not generally a recommended practice. Jenkins is really designed as a scheduler, and you can set up multiple slave nodes where Jenkins can schedule builds to run on those slave nodes. And that's the more general accepted practice. And it's very common within a real world environment to have a Jenkins master server and then have, maybe a half a dozen or a dozen different slave build nodes that are actually running all of the build jobs. And the Jenkins master server itself isn't running any build jobs. It's just handling all the scheduling of jobs, and it's providing the web interface. Now, when you set up these slave nodes, each one of the nodes has a label associated with it, and sometimes multiple labels. For example, in this environment, we have a single slave node that's set up, and that node has a label called Linux. So when we define jobs, we can specify that a job should run on the Linux node, and then Jenkins knows where to schedule that job. It's pretty common to find environments where you'll have a variety of different types of build nodes. Maybe you'll have some Linux build nodes, maybe you'll have some Windows build nodes, and each of them have different labels. And you can use the labels then to define where Jenkins should run a particular job. I mentioned that in our environment that we set up using the CloudFormation template, the CloudFormation template launches a master node and it launches a single slave node. And that single slave node has some capabilities that the master node does not have. For example, the The slave node can run AWS CLI commands. The slave node can also do things like run Docker builds. And you can't do these things on the master node. So if you were to try to run a job on the master node to do like run some sort of like AWS CLI command, it would fail because that command doesn't even exist on the master node. So the job, the build would actually fail.